"Are you lost, Grandpa?" The voice cut through the quiet reverence of the Memorial Plaza like a serrated knife. It was sharp, arrogant, and dripping with the kind of condescending authority that only comes from a man who has never been truly tested by humility. Commander Jake Bulldog Riley, his muscular frame perfectly defined by the snug fit of his uniform, stood with his arms crossed, a perfect picture of modern naval power. His eyes, narrowed into judgmental slits, were fixed on the old man standing before the black granite of the SEAL Memorial Wall. The old man didn't turn. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on a single name etched into the stone. He was a slight figure made smaller by a worn olive drab jacket that had seen better decades. His shoulders were stooped, not with weakness, but with the quiet weight of years. His hands resting on the polished stone were gnarled with age, the knuckles swollen, the skin a road map of a life lived through labor and time. Commander Riley's jaw tightened. He hated this. Civilians wandering into restricted areas of the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, treating it like a tourist park. This old man with his vacant stare and cheap clothes was the worst kind of offender. Probably some wannabe who'd read a book and now thought he understood the sacrifice engraved on this wall. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Riley snapped, stepping closer. The salty air carried the rhythmic chant of trainees on a distant grinder, a sound that was the anthem of Riley's world, a world of pain, discipline, and earned dominance. This old man represented none of that. This is a place for warriors and their families, not a public park for a Sunday stroll. You need to leave. Finally, the old man stirred. He slowly drew his hand back from the wall, his fingertips tracing the last letter of a name, as if reluctant to break contact. He turned and for the first time, Riley saw his face. It was a landscape of wrinkles, a testament to 90 years of sun and wind and worry. But it was the eyes that gave Riley a momentary pause. They were a pale, washed-out blue, yet they were utterly clear and steady. There was no confusion in them, no fear, no sility. They held a deep, unnerving stillness like the calm at the bottom of the ocean. "I'm not lost," the old man said. His voice was quiet, raspy with disuse, but it carried a strange resonance. It held no deference, no apology. It was simply a statement of fact. This unexpected lack of intimidation pricked at Riley's pride. He was a commander in the United States Navy SEALs, men twice this old man's size and half. His age snapped to attention when he spoke right. Riley sneered, recovering his footing. "Well, you're in a restricted area, so unless you've got business here, you're leaving now." He gestured dismissively toward the main gate a mile away. The old man's gaze drifted from Riley's face down to the gold seal, trident pinned pristinely above his left pocket. It was the emblem of the Brotherhood, the symbol of everything Riley had bled for. "That's a final-looking pin," the old man observed, his tone unreadable. Was he being sarcastic? Riley's temper, always simmering just below the surface, began to boil. "It's not a pin, old-timer. It's a trident. You earn it. With blood, sweat, and everything you've got. Something you wouldn't know anything about." He puffed out his chest, the trident seeming to gleam with self-importance. "So tell me, what did you do in your day? Peel potatoes? Let me guess your rank. Cook's mate, 3rd class." The insult hung in the air, sharp and ugly. A few younger SEALs taking the break nearby had noticed the confrontation and were watching with smirks on their faces. They revered their commander, and to them this was just another example of Bulldog Riley's take-no-prisoners attitude. The old man didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on the trident, but his eyes seemed to be looking through it into a different time. "Something like that," he replied softly. The ambiguity was infuriating. Riley felt his authority being subtly undermined, not by defiance, but by this strange, unshakable calm. He was used to conflict, to shouting, to physical assertion. He didn't know how to fight this quiet dignity. I need to see your identification, Riley commanded, his voice hardening into the official tone he used on disobedient recruits. And your authorization to be on this base. The old man slowly reached into the pocket of his worn jacket. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if time was a concept that no longer applied to him. Riley waited, his foot tapping impatiently on the pavement. He expected a driver's license, maybe a VFW card. He'd run the name, have the old man escorted off base, and make an example of him. He'd teach him a lesson about respecting the uniform, about respecting this sacred ground. The old man's hand emerged, not with a wallet, but with a small, dark object. He held it in his palm. It was a piece of metal tarnished with age, its details smoothed by decades of handling. It was a pin, an old, crude-looking frog with a flintlock pistol and a cutlass. It was a UDT pin, the precursor to the modern trident from an era Riley only knew from history books. He'd seen them in a museum display case once. Riley stared at the pin, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before his arrogance reasserted itself. What's that supposed to be? Some kind of souvenir you bought at a surplus store. That doesn't give you the right to be here. He reached out and jabbed a finger at the old man's chest, his voice rising. I don't have time for these games, old man. Who the hell do you think you are? Waltzing in here with your fake medals and your sob stories. This place is for real heroes. As his finger made contact with the old man's jacket, something shifted. The world seemed to tilt. For the old man, Arthur Jennings, the touch was a lightning strike, a jolt that tore through the veil of time. The bright California sun vanished, replaced by the suffocating humidity of a Vietnamese jungle. The scent of salt air was gone, choked out by the smell of mud, cordite, and fear. He wasn't 90 anymore. He was a 28-year-old lieutenant, his face smeared with camouflage paint, his body lean and hard as whipcord. Gunfire chattered in the distance, a deadly percussion against the droning of insects. He was lying in a stinking canal, the murky water up to his neck, holding a young ensign's head above the surface. The kid was barely 20, his face pale with shock, a dark stain spreading across his fatigues from a wound in his side. Stay with me, son, Arthur had whispered, his voice a low growl. Just stay with me. We're almost out. The kid's eyes were wide with terror, but he was gripping Arthur's arm with surprising strength. They're everywhere, sir. The kid, whose name was Thomas, had gasped. They're everywhere. Arthur had looked at him, his own fear locked down tight in a box of iron will. That's why we're here, Tom. Let them come. He had pulled the young man, his subordinate, his responsibility, through a kilometer of enemy-infested swamp, firing his weapon with one hand while dragging the kid with the other until they reached the extraction point. He had saved his life. He had saved Ensign Thomas Riley. The memory, visceral and violent, receded as quickly as it came. Arthur Jennings was back on the sun-drenched plaza in Coronado. The arrogant face of Commander Jake Rayleigh was inches from his own. But something in Arthur's eyes had changed. The placid blue was now the color of a winter storm over a cold sea. The stillness was gone, replaced by an intensity that made the formidable SEAL commander take an involuntary step back. He felt a chill crawl up his spine, a primal instinct warning him that he had just crossed a line he didn't even know existed. I asked you a question, Riley stammered, trying to reclaim his dominance, but finding his voice suddenly lacking its usual steel. Who are you? What was your rank? Arthur looked at the young, powerful man before him, a man who wore the legacy of the teams on his chest, but understood so little of their soul. He saw the face of the terrified boy he had dragged from the mud all those years ago. He saw the same determined jaw, the same defiant eyes. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound like rustling leaves. Rank, he repeated, the word tasting strange on his tongue. He looked past the commander, his gaze settling once more on the name etched into the memorial wall. Thomas Riley, Capt. USN, 1945 to 2010, beloved husband and father. He had come to pay his respects to the boy he had saved, the man he had mentored, the friend he had lost. Then he brought his eyes back to the son, the arrogant, ignorant product of that saved life. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger, but it landed with the force of a sledgehammer. "I commanded your father." Commander Jake Riley froze. The words didn't compute. They were nonsense. The ramblings of a confused old man commanded his father. His father had been a captain, a decorated SEAL himself, a legend in the community. This frail old man in a dusty jacket couldn't have commanded a platoon, let alone a man like Captain Thomas Riley. It was impossible. It was absurd. Yet, the way he said it, the absolute unshakable certainty in those piercing blue eyes, it short-circuited every arrogant impulse in Riley's brain. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smirks on the faces of the nearby SEALs had vanished, replaced by looks of bewilderment. The confident world of Commander Riley had just been fractured by a single impossible sentence. At that exact moment, a crisp, authoritative voice sliced through the stunned silence. "Is there a problem here, Commander?" All heads turned. Walking toward them with a purposeful stride was Rear Admiral Phillips, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. He was a man whose presence radiated authority. His uniform was immaculate, his gaze sharp. He was the highest-ranking officer on the base, a man before whom even Bulldog Riley stood a little straighter. Riley immediately snapped to attention, his mind reeling. "Sir, no sir, just dealing with a civilian who wandered into a restricted area." But Admiral Phillips wasn't looking at Riley. His eyes were fixed on the old man. And as he got closer, his expression of stern authority dissolved, replaced by something else entirely. It was a look of profound, unadulterated respect. To the utter shock of every SEAL watching, Rear Admiral Phillips, a man who commanded legions, came to a halt before Arthur Jennings and executed the sharpest salute of his career. "Captain Jennings," the Admiral said, his voice thick with reverence. "Sir, we weren't expecting you. It is an honor to have you on the base, Captain." "Sir," the words echoed in the sudden tomb-like silence of the plaza. Commander Riley felt the blood drain from his face. He looked from the saluting Admiral to the unassuming old man, and his entire reality crumbled. The world was no longer making sense. The Admiral held his salute until Arthur, with a slight, weary smile, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Only then did Phillips lower his hand. He turned to Riley, and the warmth in his eyes was replaced by Arctic frost. "Commander," he said, his voice dangerously low, "what exactly were you dealing with?" Riley's throat was dry. He felt like a trainee on the first day of Badaez, again, naked and exposed. "Sir, I didn't know." He had no identification. "I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Admiral Phillips's voice was a whip crack. "Protocol doesn't include disrespecting a living legend. Do you have any idea who this is?" He gestured toward Arthur. "This is Captain Arthur Jennings. Do you know that UDT pin you probably thought was a toy? He was one of the first men to ever wear it. He was a frogman in Korea when your grandfather was still in high school. He helped design the training program that turned boys into the men we are today. He wrote the book on unconventional warfare before the term even existed." The Admiral took a step closer to the petrified Riley, his voice dropping to a furious whisper. "The mission reports from his time in Vietnam are still classified at the highest levels. The things this man has done, the men he has saved, would make your entire career look like a vacation. He doesn't carry ID because his face is his identification to anyone who matters in this community." Phillips paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. He pointed a finger at the name on the wall. The name Arthur had been touching. You see that name? Captain Thomas Riley, a great man, a hero. And your father. He would have died in a swamp in 1968 if it wasn't for this man right here. Captain Jennings didn't just command your father, Commander. He carried him on his back for a mile under heavy fire and saved his life. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of SEALs. They were staring at Arthur Jennings now, not as a frail old man, but as if he were a ghost from the pages of their most sacred history. A hero, a legend, standing right there in front of them in a worn-out jacket, having been insulted and threatened by one of their own. Commander Riley felt a wave of nausea so profound he thought he was going to be sick. The arrogance that had been his armor for so long shattered into a million pieces, leaving him exposed and utterly ashamed. He saw it all now. The quiet dignity, the steady eyes, the lack of fear. It wasn't weakness. It was a strength so deep and so old, he couldn't even recognize it. He had mistaken a mountain for a molehill. He looked at Arthur, at the man who had saved the father he idolized, the man to whom he literally owed his existence, and he couldn't breathe. "Sir," he croaked, the word tasting like ash. "Sir," he had no words. What could he possibly say? Admiral Phillips looked ready to strip the trident from Riley's chest right then and there. "You will report to my office at 08:00 tomorrow. Commander, we are going to have a very long talk about the difference between being a warrior and being a bully." But just as the Admiral finished, a gnarled hand gently touched his arm. It was Arthur. He looked at the furious Admiral and gave a slight shake of his head. The message was clear. "Stand down." The old captain then turned his attention to the broken man in front of him. He looked at Jake Riley, and for the first time he saw not an arrogant officer, but a young man who had lost his way. He saw a son who had tried to live up to the legend of a father, and in doing so had forgotten the humility that is the true bedrock of strength. Arthur stepped closer to Riley, whose eyes were now fixed on the ground, unable to meet the old man's gaze. "Look at me, son," Arthur said, his voice soft but firm. Riley forced himself to lift his head, his face a mask of misery and shame. "That trident on your chest," Arthur began, his voice gaining a bit of its old command. "It isn't a badge of privilege. It doesn't make you better than anyone else. It's a mark of service. It means you are willing to do the hard things, the necessary things, so that others don't have to. It means you hold the lives of the men next to you as more precious than your own." He paused, letting his words settle. "Your father understood that. He was a good man, a brave man. He was scared that day in the jungle, but he never quit. That's what matters. Not the noise you make, not the rank on your collar. It's the steel inside you when everything else has turned to dust." He reached out and gently tapped the trident on Riley's chest, the same spot Riley had jabbed him just minutes before. "This doesn't give you power over people. It gives you a responsibility to them. To the civilians you protect, to the history you inherit, to the quiet heroes whose names will never be on a wall. Your father learned that lesson in the mud. It seems you get to learn it here in the sun. Consider yourself lucky." Commander Riley stood there, tears welling in his eyes, the entire foundation of his identity rocked to its core. He finally understood. The strength of a SEAL wasn't in the size of his muscles or the volume of his voice, but in the quiet humility of men like Arthur Jennings, who had faced the very worst of humanity and emerged not with arrogance, but with grace. He had been so busy trying to be a legend that he had failed to be a good man. Arthur gave him a final understanding look before turning to the Admiral. "He's a good officer, Phillips. He just needs to remember what it's all for." And with that, Arthur Jennings turned and slowly walked away, his mission complete, leaving a changed man and a vital lesson in his wake. The encounter on the plaza that day became a quiet legend in the SEAL community, a story told not to mock a commander's failure, but to teach a profound truth. It served as a reminder that the greatest heroes are often the ones you'd never notice, and that true strength is measured not by the respect you demand, but by the respect you give. It's a story that reminds us all to look past the surface, to see the history and the humanity in the eyes of our elders, because you never know when you might be standing in the presence of greatness.